On March 8, 1500, a crowd gathered at Restelo Beach, also historically known as Belém Beach, located on the northern bank of the Tagus River in Lisbon, Portugal. Near the old chapel of the Infante, a solemn mass was celebrated prior to the departure of the largest maritime expedition Portugal had organized to date. In the presence of King Manuel I, nobles, clergy, and family members, the fleet received the church's blessing. Under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral, more than 1,300 men, distributed across 10 naus, large sailing ships, and 3 caravels, embarked on a journey with the primary objective of reaching the spice-rich lands of the Indies, following the route pioneered just a few years earlier by Vasco da Gama. During the voyage, a silent enemy stalked the crew. Scurvy. Unbeknownst to them, the disease was caused by a lack of vitamin C, something science would not discover until centuries later. The first signs appeared gradually. Gums began to bleed and swell, wounds failed to heal, and teeth loosened and eventually fell out. The pain made even the act of eating an ordeal. As their bodies grew increasingly frail, infections spread, and many sailors did not survive. To 16th century men, scurvy was a mysterious and cruel affliction, capable of turning a long voyage into a slow, agonizing death sentence. Every crew member had the right to bring back a small quantity of spices from the Indies, a privilege that could amount to a fortune upon their return to Portugal. Furthermore, each man received a wage determined by his rank within the fleet's hierarchy. In many cases, a portion of this pay was issued in advance, providing some means of support for the families left behind. Families who faced the uncertainty of whether their husbands, fathers, or sons would ever return. But the price of that hope was high. Days of grueling labor and nights of fitful sleep, often spent on deck, exposed to the cold, wind, and rain. Rations were simple and meager: stale, rock-hard bread, water stored in casks, and a daily allowance of wine for each sailor. Such was the routine for the entire crew throughout a voyage lasting just over a year, as they braved storms, disease, and the constant risk of never seeing their homeland again. As the final bells rang out, and under the gaze of a crowd gathered along the banks of the Tagus River, the fleet finally began its departure. Amidst applause, prayers, and tears of farewell, 10 naus and 3 caravels slowly left the port of Lisbon. Sails filled with wind propelled the vessels toward the horizon. One woman kept her eyes fixed on the ships. She was bidding farewell to a husband, a son, or a brother. Further back, an elderly man watched the departure in silence. His weathered face reflected the experience of someone who knew the dangers of the sea. A young man observed the ships with eyes full of wonder. To him, those sails vanishing into the horizon represented adventure and the promise of a magnificent future. After sailing approximately 1,600 nautical miles, the fleet reached the island of São Nicolau in the Cape Verde archipelago. There, they restocked the ships with water and provisions and reorganized the expedition before heading out into the Atlantic. That was when the unexpected happened. One of the ships vanished without a trace. The sea remained calm, the weather was favorable, and no distress signal was seen or heard. Cabral ordered a search of the area, but all efforts were in vain. No wreckage, no sails on the horizon, no survivors. The fate of that ship remains one of the first and most intriguing mysteries of the voyage that would eventually reach Brazil. Surrounded by an infinitely blue horizon, Cabral's fleet put into practice one of the instructions left by Vasco da Gama to steer away from the African coast and make a wide sweep across the Atlantic, taking advantage of the favorable winds known as the Volta do Mar. As they advanced westward, signs began to appear that piqued the navigators' curiosity. Flocks of oceanic birds crossed the skies, and patches of vegetation floated on the water, clues suggesting the proximity of land. Some historians believe that Vasco da Gama may have already suspected the existence of land in that direction, even though he did not follow that route, as his mission was to reach the Indies. It fell to Pedro Álvares Cabral to take a more westerly course and discover what lay beyond the vast Atlantic. April 20, 1500. In the early hours of the morning, a shout broke the ocean's silence. "Land ho!" In moments, the deck was filled with excitement. Sailors rushed to the railings, pointing toward the horizon. After weeks surrounded only by the infinite blue of the Atlantic, a stretch of land was finally appearing before their eyes. In the distance, a hill with gentle yet imposing contours stood out. It was the hill Cabral would name Monte Pascoal. As the fleet slowly made its way northward, the men celebrated that unexpected sight. They did not yet know exactly where they were. They had no idea that this moment would go down in history as the arrival of the Portuguese in the lands that would come to be named Brazil. Cabral ordered the fleet to approach the shore, while sailors continuously measured the water's depth to avoid hidden sandbars and reefs. Around midday, the anchors were dropped in a safer spot. From the decks of the ships, the Portuguese spotted the first inhabitants. Ahead of the armada, the dense Atlantic forest blanketed the landscape right down to the water's edge. The ships rocked gently on the blue-green waters. Perhaps 6 or 8 men with tawny skin watched the fleet with the same curiosity with which they were being observed. Shortly thereafter, as the Portuguese boats drew closer to the beach, the number of indigenous people grew. 2 worlds that had never met before were on the verge of making first contact. As they drew near, about 20 indigenous Tupiniquim people waited on the sand, watching the visitors from the sea intently. Gestures, smiles, and unfamiliar words were exchanged. As a sign of friendship, the Portuguese offered some gifts. Among them, a red cap caught the indigenous people's attention. In return, one of the natives presented a beautiful feather headdress, initiating a symbolic exchange that would mark the first contact between those 2 worlds. Late in the afternoon, the Portuguese and the Tupiniquim parted ways peacefully. The boats returned to the ships as the weather began to turn and heavy clouds covered the sky. After conferring with his captains, Cabral concluded that the anchorage did not offer the necessary safety. The following day, the fleet would sail about 68 kilometers north, where it would find a wide cove with calmer waters, known today as Cabralia Bay. A new day dawned. The sun was rising in the east, illuminating the calm sea and the vessels anchored in the cove. Early in the morning, some indigenous people could be seen fishing among the reefs that sheltered the ships from the ocean waves. On the beach, about 60 or 70 natives had gathered, all curious about the presence of those enormous ships. Towards evening, two indigenous men were invited aboard the flagship, where Pedro Álvares Cabral welcomed them cordially. They were offered bread, fish, sweets, wine, and other foods brought from Portugal. However, they tasted very little and appeared puzzled by most of the food. After spending the night on board, the two indigenous men were taken back to the beach the following morning. When the Portuguese returned to the beach, they encountered an even larger number of indigenous people. Men, women, and children approached with curiosity, watching every movement of those visitors who had come from the sea. Among the Portuguese was Pedro Álvares Cabral, the expedition's scribe, who would record in detail everything he saw. Regarding one of the indigenous women, he wrote, "And one of those young women was dyed all over, from head to toe with that pigment, and she was truly so well formed and shapely, and her private parts, which she left uncovered, were so graceful that upon seeing such features, many women from our own land would have felt ashamed not to possess a body like hers." That same day, everyone gathered for a moment that would mark the history of the expedition. Friar Henrique de Coimbra celebrated an open-air mass before the Portuguese and under the watchful gaze of the indigenous people. Without understanding the meaning of the ritual, the indigenous people stood watching in silence, curious about the prayers, hymns, and gestures that marked the first Christian religious act performed on those lands. May 1st. In the land of Vera Cruz, the entire crew gathered for one of the expedition's most solemn moments. Before a large wooden cross erected on the sand, Friar Henrique de Coimbra celebrated the second Mass. United by faith, the Portuguese followed every prayer and hymn attentively. The indigenous people, for their part, observed everything with curiosity. Without understanding the meaning of the ritual, they watched in silence. Once the Mass concluded, Pedro Álvares Cabral gathered his captains. The decision had been made. One of the ships would return to Portugal to carry news of the discovery of the new land to King Manuel I. On board would be letters, accounts, headdresses, bows, arrows, and other objects that would help describe the people and the place. Two men would remain among the indigenous people for a time, learning their customs and language. The rest of the fleet would weigh anchor and continue the voyage to the Indies. On Saturday morning, the time for farewells arrived. The sails were hoisted once more, and Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet left the newly discovered lands behind, resuming its original mission to reach the coveted spices of the Indies. Separated from the fleet, the ship commanded by Gaspar de Lemos began the return voyage to Portugal. On board was the letter from Pedro Álvares Cabral. As the fleet approached the dreaded Cape of Storms, the ocean revealed its full might. Violent winds and towering waves tossed the vessels about. Amidst the chaos, the sailors felt death looming close, and it was not long in coming. 4 ships vanished beneath the churning waters, dragging some 400 men down with them. Among them was Bartolomeo Diaz, the navigator who years earlier had been the first European to round that very cape, opening the sea route to the Indies. Though deeply shaken, the expedition pressed on. About 6 months after leaving Portugal, Pedro Álvares Cabral finally reached Calicut, on the coast of India, where he established trade relations with local authorities. Peace, however, was short-lived. Within days, the Portuguese trading post came under attack by Arab-linked merchants and their local allies. Dozens of Portuguese perished. Enraged, Cabral ordered a ruthless response. His ships opened fire on Calicut, bombarding the city and igniting a conflict that would forever define the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean. Leaving Calicut behind, the fleet sailed south until it reached the Kingdom of Cochin. modern-day Kochi, where the Portuguese were welcomed in a friendly manner. There, they finally managed to load the ship's holds with the precious goods that justified the entire expedition: cinnamon, pepper, ginger, and other spices highly coveted in Europe. One of the vessels took on such a heavy load that it ran aground. Unable to salvage it, Cabral set it on fire. A few weeks later, a surprise awaited the expedition. Diogo Dias's ship, missing since the violent storm during the outward voyage, was found again. His men were exhausted, weakened, and marked by the long months of isolation at sea. After a voyage lasting more than a year, the fleet began the long journey back to Portugal. Despite the immense human cost, which included the death of Pedro Álvares Cabral, author of the letter documenting the Portuguese first contact with the lands of Brazil, the expedition was deemed a great success by the Portuguese crown. Although only part of the fleet returned, the surviving ships arrived back in Lisbon, laden with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and other highly valuable spices, obtained primarily in the Kingdom of Cochin. In the eyes of the crown, the profit generated by this cargo offset the enormous losses suffered during the voyage. Pedro Álvares Cabral's expedition would go down in history not only for consolidating the Portuguese route to the Indies, but also for marking the first official contact between Portugal and the lands that, decades later, would come to be known as Brazil.